Okay, right. Thanks for being with us early this morning. As Paul said, I'm going to talk about something somewhat parallel to game design, but hopefully just broadening the field so that we can think more creatively about what games are and how they apply to the work that we do. And in particular, I'm going to ask you all about what constitutes virtuous game design. How is it that we can include virtue in the games that we build such that we can discover more valuable ways of relating to one another and building cultures that actually last? So the quote which leads this whole talk, and the thing that I will emphasize over and over again, is the overall goal is to show a lot of truth with minimum contrivance. To show a lot of truth with minimum contrivance. This talk will be all about seeking truths in the games that we design. Right? So if you go to the next slide. I have some very, very simple statements to summarize everything that I'm going to say, so that if you only watch the first slide, you at least get the mantras, which we will expand upon for the rest of the talk. The first one is that virtuous games reveal valuable truths. Virtuous games reveal valuable truths. The corollary of that is that we need to seek truth in everything that we do, but particularly in the games that we design, because increasingly everything is gamified, and more often than not, the ways in which things are gamified lead to extractive and corporate behavior rather than pro-social reciprocity, which is something that we can aim for in order to try and decrease loneliness and increase our relatedness to one another, and understand a little bit more about the game universe that we're all building in. Right? Because the underlying substrate here is some notion of a shared global ledger. And so what's unique about building games in this space, as opposed to just computer games or video games in general, is that the universe, to some extent, is already instantiated for you. And that universe has two critical mechanics, right? One of which is provided by the founder of Protocol Labs, Juan Benet. It's verifiability, right? It's not read, write, own. It might be read, write, verify, but we'll get to that later in the talk. And the other is distributed trust, right? These two things are absolutely critical to understand in the games that we build, because they're not the things that are often emphasized by American VCs and other people who have specific kind of interests and agendas in how they describe what blockchains are and how they might be used in the world and what's interesting and playful about them, right? They will tell you that this is about trustlessness. It's not. It's about distributing trust so that the people that we actually trust are those on the other end of our transactions, not the people sitting in between them. And that notion of distributed trust is directly related to how we distribute power, right? Because ultimately, that's what it all comes down to. The games that we build, the substrates we use, the blockchains that power a lot of that are all about distributing power, right? The fourth and final one, go back, is that making games is an interesting way to design mechanisms. Design is in bold because it's important, right? It's often said that, like, oh, games are interesting places to experiment with mechanisms, to gather data about what works and what doesn't. I'm making a much stronger statement here. Making games is an incredible way to design mechanisms. It's also a wonderful way to test them, experiment with them, see how people use them in the world. But fundamentally, it is the best way we have of actually designing mechanisms, because building virtuous games is directly equivalent to understanding what mechanisms actually lead to pro-social and aligned incentives in the world. That's how we build valuable truths and resilient culture. Okay, so the first thing to say here is that I'm not talking about capital T truth, right? This is not a moral talk, and I am not a preacher. I'm talking about little t truths, right? And you find these all the time in games. Jonathan Blow, the indie game designer that I quoted at the beginning, and from which a lot of this talk is taken, begins illustrating this particular notion of little t truths by saying that, for instance, a little t truth that leads to an interesting game mechanic is the realization that lines that intersect in 2 dimensions don't necessarily need to intersect in 3 dimensions, which is how he built a whole game involving light bridges, where you can shoot light bridges in kind of horizontal planes, and then as you go through the game mechanic illustrates deeper and deeper truths about the universe, because one time you need to get to a door that's kind of down and to your right, and the way that you do it is by shooting a light bridge across and then walking halfway across the light bridge, dropping off the light bridge and shooting another one at just the right time to get to the door below you, right? So this is like a little t truth, a truth about the game universe that is fascinating to understand and doesn't have anything to do with like morality, ideology, or politics. It's just like the game designer's point is to identify little t truths that are really, really interesting and then explore the consequences fully. And what that means, right, in terms of exploring the consequences fully and doing so in a very natural manner, sort of scaling up the complexity that people experience through your simple game mechanic, is that you strip anything arbitrary away from it, right? This is really important to understand, both in terms of the games that we design, but also in terms of like mechanism design and blockchains more generally, because most of the time what people are trying to do is build the most complicated thing we possibly can, because don't you know we really need to look intelligent in order to get VC money, and so let's complicate our mechanism with as many different things as we possibly can in order to convince people that we really know what we're talking about. Whereas the actual truth, right, is something that is discovered very, very naturally through play, and by stripping away all of your own projections and arbitrariness so that it feels to the player like they are discovering something about the universe, not trying to read the game designer's mind. Right? That distinction is an absolutely critical one. You're not trying to play by the arbitrary conventions of someone else. You're actually trying to discover something inherent about the universe, right? And in this sense, it's like the game universe, but this notion of the universe extends much further, because if you go to the next slide, you'll see that like basically in Jonathan Blow's way of looking at the world and in my own, games are an incredibly essential and effective lens to point at the universe in order to understand different aspects of it, right? Like it's said that mathematics is an unreasonably effective tool, which is a very funny thing if you think about the amount of reason and rationality and logic that is exercised in the pursuit of mathematical truth. But the same thing is true of games, right? When you're trying to strip all of your own arbitrary stuff out of the mechanisms by which your game works and instead illustrate some natural truth about the universe in which it's happening, then you can get to a place where the game becomes another lens by which we understand the functioning of the universe at large, right? Like general truths that might just be applicable outside of the game world in addition to being true in it. Right? There's so many examples of this, and Paul can share the Jonathan Blow talk on which this is based afterwards, where he talks about VVVVVVV and a time game where the mechanism is kind of like winding time back, that then doesn't apply to some objects. Each of these games is based on a very, very simple mechanism, which once explored fully gives you a really, really deep understanding of consequences that are also true in our universe. So this is the point that I really wanted to make as we talk about like game design and mechanisms. Mechanism design is not about making complex things, it's about simplifying complex insights, right? The insights, even though it sounds somewhat trivial, that lines which intersect in 2 dimensions need not in 3 dimensions, because they can be one above another, is an enormously complex thing once you really get thinking about it, right? And the point is through natural gameplay to illustrate to the player that that is true in a way which they discover themselves, right? Because that's how you really inculcate agency and responsibility in anything that is learned by the people who are playing your games, as opposed to forcing a contrived notion of what the truth might be onto them in the very first stage or level, and then being confused why people don't like your game, right? And this is especially true, once again, with like things that try to merge blockchains and games, because you're working with 2 inherently complex phenomena, right? Play is absolutely foundational to what it means to be human, right? What is the point if we can't have fun is a lovely title of an article by David Grieber, which talks about how deep the notion of play really goes. And it really is at like basically the foundational substratum of our psyche, right? The notion of ritual play is always how we've exercised our ability to imagine alternative realities and then step into the ones that seem to be the most relevant and valuable. And blockchains themselves are also like inherently complex things, right? So if you just go back one slide, the mechanism design is about asking the most simple what-if questions, right? And then exploring the consequences fully. Because this is what mathematicians do as well, right? They build like higher order abstractions by asking these really, really simple what-if questions. Like, what if Euclid's axioms were not true, or were not the only axioms that we could approach modeling the world through? And then let's go and explore that fully in at least a spherical geometry, or like a different form of topology, or like an alternative understnding of homomorphic topology, whatever it is, right? Like, and you can go and explore the whole world and all of its consequences fully, and that leads to like interesting and surprising results. The same is true here. We're not trying to like build towards something complex. What you're trying to do is understand a complex phenomena by removing all that is arbitrary from it to get to the most simple and essential aspects of what is happening, and then ask, what if something were different? What if this were true rather than that? And then explore the consequences fully. So to really like drive this home, right? Game design and mechanism design in my world, like the aesthetics of these two things, which are strongly linked to the ethics. In fact, if you ever studied Wittgenstein, you might think that these two are the same things, right? Which is to say that it's just two things. It's just two very, very simple steps. It's mine nuggets of truth. It's like really actively seek the truth that you want to illustrate to the people who play your games, right? And like this doesn't have to be a profound moral truth, right? Like lines that intersect in 2 dimensions need not necessarily intersect in 3 dimensions is not like a moral statement, but it's very interesting, and it can be used to make incredible games that are like very sticky and enormously successful, right? So I'm not talking about like go and look for the ultimate truth of who you are, although that's also interesting, but just find the truths that you want to illustrate and then package that truth for the player, right? And this is really like the most interesting parts in terms of game design and how you actually get that stuff into the real world in a way that people can appreciate and benefit from. So how do we actually do that? I have eight principles for how to package truth for people. The first is richness, right? There's like so many truths that you could possibly explore with people, especially when you start imagining in this little t sense, not some kind of like moral, ideological, or political capital T truth. Just like any kind of truth which is in and of itself interesting. And there are an infinity of them, right? So the question is like which ones lead to the richest possible set of interactions in the games that we're interested in building, right? Like what is it about verifiability and all of the associated cryptography and, one could say kind of race conditions associated with how that is achieved in blockchains, or what is it about distributed trust that is really like most fascinating to you? And there are an infinity of combinations of truth that you could possibly explore. Jaden was telling me today about designated verifier proofs, right? Never heard of them, super interesting. There's a fascinating truth in like hashes and secrets, which is amazingly interesting to explore, right? So there's lots of different things that you could do, but the way to try and like identify which ones are relevant now in the games that we build and the kinds of mechanisms that we design is like which ones lead to the most interesting consequences. Completeness is the corollary of that, right? It's like once you've found something which is really rich, surprisingly so, right? You need to explore its consequences fully, right? You can't just say, oh, like what happens if we had a game that was like based on spherical geometry rather than Euclidean, and then like have like a few superficial interactions based on that. It's like really like push it all the way to the end that you possibly can, right? Like all of the consequences need to be explored and they need to be applied to each object in the game, right? This is like the time rewinding game that Jonathan Blow's talking about in his talk, similar to this one, right? Like every object in the game needs to be able to be rewound through time. But then, this is kind of mediated by the third principle, which is surprise, right? Occasionally, in the combination of rich mechanics, you can find really, really surprising and unpredictable results. The example that he gives is that some objects in the game can't be rewound. And when you've explored the space of time rewinding fully, and then you have this mechanic that a few objects are immune to that, you get all sorts of totally fascinating interactions that you can build like incredibly rich and complex levels from in the game, which are like surprising to everybody, especially the designer themselves, right? Because everything else that is arbitrary has been removed. So we're not trying to read the mind of the designer, rather understand the nature of the universe in which the game is happening. And then lightest contrivance, again, like the less contrivance you have, the closer to the truth you get. And this is useful in game designs because like it's really difficult if you've ever built a game to try and like hone down to like the 1 or 2 mechanics that are really going to make your game sticky and successful. And this is how you do it, right? You ask, which of the mechanics do I have relative to all of the other ones? Which of them feel poor? Which of them yield the most interesting results, and which of them, like relatively speaking, yield less of them? So you can have like a really interesting mechanic. One of them yields like 20 interesting results. the other yields 10, even if that one is super interesting, if it yields 10 as opposed to 20 interesting results, it's going to feel poor relative to the one that yields 20. So you know that you can cut it, even if it's like really close to your heart. It's happened to me that like the mechanic that I thought I was building a game around ended up being that one. And I had discovered like a new mechanic in the course of my explorations that was just much more interesting. And so like I ended up having to cut the original mechanic, which was a very difficult thing to do, and like follow along with what I had discovered because it was just much richer and more interesting once I'd completely explored the possible space of consequences. Then there's the strength of the boundary, having like found the like one or two mechanics that are most interesting to you. Like you need to draw a strong boundary around it, i.e. like remove anything arbitrary again. Like just get rid of everything that doesn't illustrate the truth that you are trying to package for the player, right? Once more, in blockchains, when we try and combine blockchains with games, you see this done really, really badly, right? We're trying to like put way too much stuff into the game because we're trying to illustrate the whole universe of blockchains. It's like, let's not do that, right? Like there's two key mechanisms, verifiability and distributed trust. Each of those things has a whole kind of sub-universe of mechanics that's possible to explore. Any one of them could make a really fascinating game. It's not necessary to try and like build a game that illustrates everything that's valuable about blockchains or interesting and then package it into game format. It doesn't really work because you don't have strong boundaries, and so it's not easy for people to explore fully the consequences of any given mechanic that you include. Compatibility just means that like the mechanics that you do choose shouldn't like contrast with one another too much. And it's somewhat related to orthogonality, right? So orthogonality, it's like a geometric term. It means that the mechanics that you have should explore the design space as fully as possible without overlapping each other. So like a classic example of this is a shoot 'em up game that Mark 10 Bosch designed, where like the mechanics are either you can like shoot at the aliens coming down the screen with like various different kinds of weapons that get upgraded over each level, or you can change colors. And like if you change to red, then you can't get hit by any of the red bullets, right? And these are like two game mechanics that are basically orthogonal to one another, right? Like either you're killing aliens by shooting at them with like increasingly powerful weapons, or you're avoiding bullets that might kill you by switching between colors, right? And so like you've explored more and more of the possible design space in the game without having mechanics that overlap one another, which is kind of interesting. And then the last one, and the thing that I really want to focus on for blockchains, is generosity, right? And like generosity is a consequence of orthogonality and completeness, so having game mechanics that don't overlap and yet that explore the design space fully, because what it allows for is that like the mechanic that you actually have in your game, if it's like rewinding through time, it applies to absolutely everything. You can always do it, right? Or Mark 10 Bosch designed a game in which you can flip dimensions. There's actually 4 dimensions in his universe, and you can like flip dimensions so you can like climb up a wall that is otherwise unscalable when you're only looking at through like the other 3 dimensions. And you can always do that, right? There's nothing arbitrary that limits you, because the point is to try and explore the nature of the universe rather than the like mind of the designer. And this is super interesting because if you think about it in the context of blockchain mechanisms, my argument is that function modifiers in Solidity contracts are very ungenerous. Right? If you're modifying your function such that it's only owner or only admin or only game operator, then it's not a generous game, right? And it's like really important to think about this kind of stuff because it shows the direct corollary, right? Like the deep analogy between mechanism design as it's imagined in the blockchain space and what has always been happening in game mechanics, right? Generosity, like it's fascinating to me how few generous contracts exist in the world of blockchains. It's because like not many Solidity developers are like operating by game design principles, and this is one of the most interesting. Okay, so like Jonathan ends by saying like, well, how do you make a good puzzle? And it's not by making it hard, right? We're not talking about making hard games, by making them complex, by making them complicated, right? It's not even by trying to make it good, right? It's just by finding a truth and illustrating it for someone, right? Like that's the puzzle that really like grasps people, right? The Chinese finger trap is like a timeless game because there's something really, really, really fascinating at a deep psychological level about like, hey, I can't pull my finger out if I'm actively trying to, right? Because it illustrates a kind of contradiction and tension that we find all over in our lives. Like the moment that you grasp for something and really want it and desire it is exactly the same moment as it slips out of your reach forever, right? And the Chinese finger trap illustrates that. And so we love it. And every generation loves it. Because it's the truth about who we are and what the universe is and how stuff works that's illustrated in an enormously simple way that's just endlessly fascinating, especially to kids, but kind of to all of us once you see that, right? Okay. So this one's a bit small, sorry, but it's the same as the aesthetics, right? The point of the puzzle is to show some truth. So know what that truth is, and then remove anything which is not that truth, right? Step 2 is the hardest, but it's related to step 3, right? Like know what the truth is. You often figure out what the truth that you're actually trying to illustrate through game design or through mechanism design is by knowing exactly what it's not, right? Those two things actually go together, and it's a long philosophical tradition. It's called via negativa, or you find it in Islam, it's called la ilaha, right? So like there's lots of different ways of approaching this particular thing, but knowing what the truth is and understanding all the things that it's not are deeply interrelated, and it's like a very powerful mechanism in your toolbox as a game designer for stripping away all of that arbitrariness so that the universe has this natural feel that people are moving through and learning of themselves what properties and functions it exhibits. Right, next up. Okay, yeah, very, very briefly, this is like a game that I have designed, right? It's called Honor. It's about currency. Because like that's my primary interest, and I'm not like Paul. I am really suck at Unreal Engine, and I'm only just learning Godot. But this is the result of a very simple what-if question, which is what if the ERC20 token balances that you have in your wallet didn't represent assets, they rather represented liabilities, right? And it's like a very small change to the ERC20 standard that allows you to do this kind of thing. And all of a sudden, you can, in an interesting sequence of events that require transacting with other people, learn about the universe of honor by like gradually moving through it based on this very, very, very simple what-if question. What if your balance was not a good thing, but a bad thing? And what does a bad thing really mean? What does it mean to have like obligations or liabilities to one another? So I just included it here because I want you to see that games need not look like the most fancy like MMORPGs out there. Games can be anything. And in fact, when you combine blockchains with like this notion of game design, that game can like bleed into the real world in very, very interesting ways. The way that I wanted to end here is by saying that like this pursuit of individual truth is not the only thing that matters, right? It's very, very important to us individually as we explore what makes interesting game mechanics and how do we actually go about designing these things. The other question is not just about the solipsistic individual going out and seeking truth and then trying to make good mechanisms based on it. It's like, how do you share that truth, right? And you know, I've sort of said that like it really depends on how we sequence stuff, and you know, we've discussed a bit of that already in terms of like, well, you can have like these non-intersecting lines, and then people gradually, as they go through levels, learn about how those lines need not intersect and how they can get to places that are diagonal away from them, or how to move through time when some objects don't move backwards, or how to flip dimensions in order to get rewards on top of walls that are otherwise unclimbable. The way that you scale up player ability over each level really matters. But the fascinating aspect of this, which again points to a very deep universal truth that is relevant in our time, is that like the really big idea is not just like the sequence in which you get people to learn stuff in your game as you scaffold up their abilities. It's that you show them a particular pattern of cognition and thinking and then break their perception of that pattern in order to show them higher order complexity, right? And this is like true of our own universe. If you think about like some of the deepest physics that you can do, right? It's all based on symmetry. So how Maxwell found the equations for light, right? It's like by thinking about like deep symmetries that exist between like different kinds of fields. But then you find that there's something, when you really look at Maxwell's equations for light, that is asymmetrical about them. And that breaking of the symmetry in order to see something higher order is like a very, very deep way in which we uncover fundamental physics. So you could like look for symmetries in, you know, the strong and weak nuclear force, and you come to quantum chromodynamics and all the work that Frank Wilczek did, or you look for symmetries in the electromagnetic force and its quantum electrodynamics and Richard Feynman, but they also like have these slight breaks, right? And in fact, right down at the base of what we know about physics right now is like an asymmetry in the W boson emission event, right? Which is like exactly what we see in the games that Mark and Jonathan and these kind of indie gamers design, is like show the player a pattern of interacting with the world. Oh, look, if I shoot a light bridge here and then fall off and shoot one there, I can like do interesting things that would otherwise not be possible. Or in VVVVV, I can like invert gravity and turn 180 or like turn a full circle, but then like break their perception of that by like putting them in a maze that like turns a full circle and goes straight into a wall. And then, you know, there's something really delightful about that moment, and people keep on coming back to the game and figuring their way out in new and interesting ways, using higher order concepts, because they're like both used to the way that you're thinking about like the symmetry of the universe, and then also the ways in which that surprises us in unpredictable fashion. Yeah, and then because we have a Kurt Vonnegut book here, thank you, Paul. Come and read it when you're done. Like, it's not just about like the individual search for truth, it's also about like building relationships, right? Because like that's virtuous games. Search for truth, package it for the player, right? How do you build valuable culture out of that? Well, it's about thinking about how you cultivate relationships in your games, right? Because, you know, games and their mechanics alter incentive structures which change how we behave. And the question is how can we like understand and research how we behave? Robert Sapolsky wrote a book called Behave, so thanks, Paul, for having all of this supporting material for me. It's like, how can we think about how we behave such that we can live well together, right? Because that's ultimately what we want. And like, there's really something interesting about games, because when they are designed in ways that the truths only sort of explicate something like solipsistic, something individual, then they tend to foster increased loneliness, right? And loneliness is like really the thing that we're fighting against in some way, right? In many ways, like why is it that we want to distribute power? Why is it that we yearn for more equitable worlds? Why is it that we care about distributed networks where we can like directly transact with our peers rather than relying on some kind of faceless intermediary? It's because we're sick and tired of a world in which the only thing that we ever get to have meaningful relationships with are exactly faceless intermediaries, right? You want to re-enrich that experience with the personal, with an aspect of care. And games are a wonderful way to do that, although they're also the thing that is used to foster like toxicity and loneliness the most, because they're built in ways that extract our attention rather than enrich it. And so the way that we can do this, you know, is building relationships between players. The content for this particular slides and the one that follows comes from a research report written by folks at the Lost Garden, which focuses specifically on like pro-social games. So it's not just about like finding the truth that you want to illustrate and leaving it there. It's like, how do you find that truth and then relate to it and relate with others by means of it, right? You know that like if you're a mathematician and you find somebody else who also like shares your passion, the resonance in your relationship is much deeper, right? So it's not just about like finding some kind of truth in and of yourself, but it's about being able to relate to that truth and relate via that truth with others. So like the thought that I kind of wanted to leave you with is that when economics is perceived as a science rather than as a design practice, it erases many of the social phenomena we're interested in examining, right? And this is precisely it, is that like if you think that you're building an in-game economy to illustrate just some particular truth that applies to the individuals, rather than like a notion of reciprocity and relatedness between them, you're going to end up in this place where it erases all of the stuff that you're actually interested in trying to foster. And if you move to the next slide, how much time do I have left? I feel like I'm... Okay, I'll carry on. The way in which you do this to try and match my 8 principles of richness, completeness, the surprise, the lightest contrivance, the generosity, the orthogonality, the compatibility, is another 8 particular principles for trying to do pro-social game design in addition to that which searches for truth. I won't go through all of them in great detail because the slides will be available afterwards, but the thing that I want to say is that like you can actually, if you just go back to the previous slide, friendship and trust are really, really interesting things to design for, and they can actually be very consciously designed for in the games that you build, right? Friendship is almost directly measured through something called contextual reciprocity. And the point that I really want you all to understand about this is that like when we're designing games, it's always to do with like virtual assets, right? So like any kind of scarcity in your game is an aesthetic choice rather than a feature of the universe, right? And the same thing is true when you're building tokens on a blockchain, right? Like any kind of scarcity that you impose with that or in your mechanism is an aesthetic choice. It's not a feature of the universe of blockchains. This is something that's been quite difficult to get across to people and for them to understand because we're so used to operating in scarcity as it relates to economics. And the point about friendship is that reciprocity is actually the complementary opposite of scarcity. It's not abundance, right? It's not like abundance versus scarcity, because like that whole framework, if you're thinking I'm going to like fight scarcity by just having abundant tokens, it doesn't work, precisely because abundance denies the very material realities that often lead to an understanding of scarcity, whereas reciprocity helps us navigate scarcity, because when I give what I need, right, and acknowledge the material limitations in which that happens, then there is an opening into something more than abundance, right? And like friendship is the way that you do this. Abundance comes later when we think about shared vulnerability, right? Shared vulnerability is like a big part of how you actually build trust and friendship in games. If you see like EVE Online, they'll have these guilds and they'll do initiation rituals in their guilds. And like when you join, you'll get given an impossible task with a whole bunch of other people and you'll definitely die and lose all of your stuff. But then the guild will like come and replace it for you and say, okay, like now you're a part of the guild because you've done the thing, right? And like sacrifice is the opposite of abundance. These two things go together. Scarcity and reciprocity go together. And so if you do have scarce resources in your game because you make that as an aesthetic choice, then understand that those scarce resources can be used to foster friendship rather than toxicity. And if they are resulting in zero-sum interactions and competition, there's something about the design that needs to be tweaked in order to foster friendship instead, in order to encourage people to give to one another as a result of the scarcity that you've designed into your game, rather than compete with one another around it. The same way in which, like, if there is sacrifice required, it's not some notion of martyrdom and like the lonely hero. If there's sacrifice required in your game, it should be in the context of generating shared vulnerability, because these kinds of things ultimately combat the loneliness and toxicity that we're interested in acting against, both with blockchains and with games in general, hopefully. To sum up those 9 principles, we want to honor the unmeasured, trust and positive sum resources. There's a whole bunch in there which I've skipped about agonics and positive sum resources, which you can read afterwards. We want to facilitate connection and we want to facilitate expression, right? So find the truth, package it for the player, and package it in a way which honors the unmeasured, which facilitates real reciprocity and which facilitates people's expression and how they interact with that. Next one. Yeah, there you go. So there's one final quote which comes from Dr. Ben Hunt, and I think it's worth reading to finish it up, which he says, "I think everyone's woken up." This is my aspirational part. I think everyone's woken up. How you guys feeling? Or been forced to realize that the old rules don't work. Frankly, they never did. It's just that we all believed that they did. Everyone's now thinking in terms of narrative and playing the player in these strategic interactions, which I think is so important for understanding the real power structures in the world and how and what we can do to change them, right? The real power structures in the world and what we can do to change them. And when you understand that game design is not just to trivialize things and kind of anesthetize people such that they're not thinking about the problems that actually exist in the world, but is rather a lens at which we can use to point at the universe, and in particular understand both loneliness and power, and how to build incentive structures that root around those things or that direct them in much more interesting and valuable ways that are premised in reciprocity and resilience, then I think we're doing something interesting. So this is my hope for everybody here today. And thank you very much for listening to me ramble through all of that.
Thank you, Andy. Do you have time for some questions, Andy?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So if anyone has any question, just raise their hand. But maybe I can start. Like it's interesting how you thought of, I guess, honor as the gameplay, and what was kind of the genesis for that? Why did you think of making a game based around honor?
Yeah, so that comes from some people whose in Canada, they built something called the Open Money Manifesto, which is like a locally exchange-traded system, and they were functional programmers. So they had this notion of like currency namespaces, so we could have Andy Paul coin, and then we could like have infinite recursion in those like namespaces. We could have like Andy Paul work coin and Andy Paul NPC day coin because you owe me for being here, and you know, like on and on and on and on, right? And they made a game out of it, and the idea was that if you could make the game sticky enough, then one day people who had come back through enough different contexts to the game would realize, holy shit, we can just use this as currency without any modifications, right? So this is like, it's like games as a gateway drug to understanding that like money need not be what it is in the world as it currently exists, but can be like radically different, because like that's the whole promise, right? Like programmable currency that can actually be meaningful. But like what that requires is a certain kind of belief in a large enough group of people that instantiate that in the world, right? And how do you get there? It's certainly not by standing on a soapbox and being like, hey, this is a much better form of money. It's like by building games, right? And so like the Ani interface isn't very interesting. We could do a much better job. But the point is, like, if you imagine it as a game and try and get people there through multiple different contexts, then hopefully, yeah, like one day they realize this is just money. We can just use it, right?
Awesome. Anyone else have any questions? Going once. Cool. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you so much.